The morning began the way most mornings began. For Marcus Ellison, quiet, unremarkable, wrapped in the kind of silence that only a man who has buried a wife and learned to live around the hole she left behind can create for himself. He stepped out of a convenience store on the corner of a street he had walked 100 times before, a paper cup of coffee warming his hand, the steam curling up past a face that had long since stopped giving anything away. 4 patrol cars braked hard in front of him before he had taken more than a few steps toward his car. 4 officers surrounded him like he was the most dangerous man in the city, boxing him in against the cold morning air. One of them ripped the coffee cup out of his hand and let it fall to the pavement. Another shoved him forward against the hood of his own sedan and told him, in a voice thick with contempt, that today he was going to learn what respect for the police actually looked like. None of them noticed the watch on his wrist, an ordinary-looking piece that was in fact an encrypted FBI communication device. None of them had any idea that the entire encounter was already being recorded, and that the recording would become part of the very investigation aimed directly at them. 42 years old, tall, but not imposing, Marcus had built a life out of not being noticed. Since his wife Elena passed away, he had learned to live small, to want little, to keep his footprint light in a world that had already taken more from him than he cared to measure. He wore the same faded gray hoodie more often than not, drove a sedan that had crossed the 10-year mark without complaint, and carried himself like a man who fixed things for a living, which, as far as the neighborhood was concerned, he did. He took odd jobs repairing fences and patching drywall for elderly neighbors who paid him in cash and homemade meals, and every single one of them would have sworn, without hesitation, that Marcus Ellison was exactly what he appeared to be, a quiet handyman with a soft voice and careful hands. He kept the same routine most days: up before sunrise, coffee from the same store, a slow walk through streets he had come to know better than the men paid to patrol them. Streets he had spent nearly a year memorizing block by block, learning which porch lights stayed on too late, and which storefronts pulled their shutters down a little earlier than they used to. Small details that told him more about a neighborhood than any official report ever could. Nobody on that block knew that behind the quiet exterior was a senior FBI agent with more than 15 years of service, a man who had spent the better part of the last several months buried so deep under cover that even his own neighbors believed the cover story completely, a deception maintained with such patience and such consistency that not one of them ever thought to question it. That morning, like most mornings, he had simply wanted coffee before the day demanded anything else of him. Inside the store, the clerk, a heavy-set man named Walter, who had worked that same counter for nearly a decade, greeted Marcus the way he always did, calling him by the wrong name out of habit and getting the usual quiet correction in return, a small, familiar exchange that had become its own kind of comfort over the months. Marcus paid in exact change, the way he always did, tucked the coffee into his hand, and pushed open the glass door into a morning that looked, from the outside, exactly like every other morning that had come before it. He had no reason to expect anything different. The case he had been building was close to finished, close enough that he had allowed himself, in the privacy of his own apartment the night before, to imagine what life might look like once it was over, once he no longer had to measure every interaction against the possibility that someone was watching him for reasons that had nothing to do with a broken fence or a leaking pipe. He had come to the bureau by way of a childhood spent watching his own father, a postal worker named James Ellison, get stopped and questioned on his own street for no reason anyone could ever articulate, an experience that planted in Marcus, long before he understood what to call it, a quiet determination to become the kind of person who decided what fairness actually looked like, rather than simply enduring whatever version of it other people handed down. He studied criminal justice on a partial scholarship, worked nights loading trucks to cover the rest of the tuition, and applied to the bureau twice before finally being accepted on his third attempt at the age of 26. Elena had been the one who told him not to quit after that second rejection letter, sitting across from him at a kitchen table in an apartment barely large enough for 2 people and a stack of unpaid bills, telling him simply, that the world needed more people like him, inside rooms most people never got invited into. He had carried that sentence with him through 15 years of cases most people would never hear about, and he carried it into this one as well, months before 4 officers ever surrounded him outside a convenience store. The complaints that built this particular case had come slowly, almost reluctantly, from people who had every reason to believe that speaking up would only make their situation worse. Frank Delgado, the restaurant owner, had waited nearly 8 months after the payments started before finally calling the federal hotline, terrified that reporting the officers who patrolled his block would result in exactly the kind of retaliation he had watched happen to a neighboring shop 2 years earlier. The laundromat owner, a widow named Carol Jenks who ran the business alone after her husband's passing, had kept a private notebook hidden beneath her register recording every cash payment she had been forced to make, dates and amounts stretching back nearly 3 years. Evidence she handed over to Marcus during one late-night meeting with hands that would not stop trembling. The daycare owner, a woman named Patricia Vance, described how one of the 4 officers had once threatened to report false health violations against her home unless she agreed to a standing monthly arrangement, a threat that had kept her paying quietly for the better part of 2 years, out of fear that losing her license would mean losing her only source of income. Each story, gathered one careful conversation at a time, had added another thread to the case Marcus was slowly weaving together until the pattern became too large and too consistent to ever be dismissed as coincidence. The 4 officers who had just come off their overnight shift were standing near their cruisers when Marcus walked out of the store, and one of them looked him over with the particular kind of distaste that some men reserve for strangers who have done nothing wrong except exist in the wrong place at the wrong time. He muttered to the others that the man looked like trouble, the kind of comment tossed out casually, almost bored, as though sizing up trouble were a skill he took pride in. Marcus heard it. He always heard everything. That was part of the job, but he gave no reaction, no glance, no change in his pace. He simply kept walking toward his car, coffee in hand, the first small omen of the morning already planted and already ignored. Somewhere behind that stillness, though, a familiar discipline was already switching on, the same quiet vigilance he carried into every room he had ever walked into on the job. The habit of a man who had learned long ago never to assume a moment was harmless, simply because it looked ordinary. A habit that had kept him alive through cases far more dangerous than anything a single, ordinary morning should have contained. By the time Marcus reached the parking lot, the 4 officers had positioned themselves to cut him off entirely, spreading out in a loose half-circle so that there was no direction he could move without walking straight into one of them. They demanded his identification. They ordered him to open his trunk. They told him to spread his arms so they could search him, and when Marcus asked, calmly, what exactly he was being accused of, not one of them offered an answer. Instead, one of the younger officers, a wiry man with a buzzed haircut and a badge that read Doyle, called him by a name meant to wound, rather than identify, the kind of word chosen specifically because of the color of his skin and nothing else. Another officer, heavier, slower moving, a man named Bracco, shoved Marcus by the shoulder, hard enough to make him stumble half a step. A third officer knocked the coffee cup from his other hand, this time sending the last of it splattering across the asphalt in a dark, spreading stain. Marcus said nothing. He held his hands where they could see them and let his face stay as still as stone, even as something tightened low in his chest, a familiar, disciplined anger that 15 years of federal work had taught him to carry without ever letting it show. A woman walking her dog on the far side of the street slowed to watch, then quickened her pace and looked away, the way people often did when trouble seemed too large to involve themselves in. An older man sweeping the sidewalk in front of a barber shop paused with the broom still in his hands, uncertain whether to say something or simply pretend he hadn't seen. Whatever fury the watching world might have felt on his behalf, Marcus kept buried, because breaking now would ruin something far larger than his own pride. By the end of that first exchange, the officers had forced him to plant both hands against the hood of his sedan, legs spread, head down, in the exact posture reserved for men The department had already decided we're guilty of something, even if nobody could say what. The oldest of the four, a heavyset sergeant named Hal Whitfield with more than 20 years on the force and a face that had gone permanently sour sometime in the last decade of it, leaned in close enough that Marcus could smell stale coffee on his breath. "Today," Whitfield told him, "you're going to learn how to behave." Marcus, still pressed against the hood, asked again what crime he was supposed to have committed, and again silence answered him, because there was no crime. There had never been a crime. There was only four men who had decided, in the space of a few seconds outside a convenience store, that they had found themselves an easy target. Officer Kowalski, the fourth of the group, pulled Marcus's wallet from his back pocket and began flipping through it without asking permission, fingers moving past a driver's license, a worn photograph tucked behind a clear plastic sleeve, an old picture of Elena holding their daughter as an infant, a picture Marcus had carried every single day since the day she died. Kowalski held it up and laughed, turning to the others to announce, with a kind of cruel surprise, that the man apparently had a family after all, as if that fact somehow made the humiliation more satisfying rather than less justified. Doyle leaned over to look, snorted, and asked where that family was now, wondering aloud whether they had simply gotten tired of him, a question that landed harder than he probably intended, though he showed no sign of caring either way. Marcus said nothing. His jaw tightened, just slightly, the only outward sign that anything had landed. Beneath the surface, a memory rose, and fell in less than a second. Elena's laugh, the weight of a small hand curled around his finger, gone as quickly as it had come, folded back down into the same place. He kept everything he could not afford to feel in that moment. With his hands still flat against the hood of the car, he pressed two fingers against the underside of his watch and activated the hidden signal that would summon everything that was coming next. None of the four men noticed. The emergency alert had already been sent. Nearly 6 miles away, inside a nondescript field office that gave no outward hint of what it housed, a surveillance technician sat up straight the moment the alert appeared on her screen. A small red marker blinking against a live map that showed Marcus's exact location. She called across the room to her supervisor, and within seconds, the quiet, routine hum of an ordinary morning shift had transformed into something far more urgent. Agent Sarah Mitchell, who had spent the last 4 months coordinating the operation from behind the scenes, was pulled from a briefing and shown the live feed streaming in from the hidden cameras positioned near that exact parking lot. She watched, jaw tightening, as 4 uniformed officers surrounded a man she had personally briefed only 2 days earlier, and gave the order to move without hesitation. Because whatever else the case required, the safety of her agent came first. What none of them understood, what none of them could have possibly imagined standing in that parking lot with a man they believed was nothing more than an easy morning's entertainment, was the story that had brought Marcus Ellison to that exact spot on that exact day. He had joined the Bureau more than 15 years earlier, young and idealistic in a way he no longer fully recognized in himself. And over the years, the idealism had hardened into something quieter and more durable, a simple, stubborn belief that the badge was supposed to mean something. He had worked cases across 3 different states, testified in courtrooms where his own safety had been threatened, and buried more than one informant whose only crime had been trusting the wrong system to protect them. For the past several months, he had been operating deep undercover on a case that had started as a routine complaint and grown into something far uglier. A pattern of officers within this precinct, taking bribes from local business owners, running protection schemes, disguised as community policing, falsifying arrest reports to inflate their numbers, and using unlawful force against residents who had no way to fight back. The investigation had begun almost a year earlier, when a restaurant owner named Frank Delgado quietly approached a federal hotline to report that he was paying nearly $400 a month to a group of officers simply to avoid having his business harassed with bogus citations. His complaint might have gone nowhere on its own, but 3 more came in over the following months. A laundromat owner, a mechanic, and a woman who ran a small daycare out of her home, each describing a version of the same arrangement: cash paid quietly in exchange for being left alone. Marcus had spent weeks earning the trust of people too frightened to speak on the record, sitting in back rooms and kitchens long after closing hours, piecing together names, dates, and dollar amounts, until a pattern too consistent to be coincidence had fully emerged. 4 names sat at the center of that investigation: Whitfield, Doyle, Bracco, Kowalski. The very 4 men now standing around him in a parking lot, congratulating themselves on having found an easy morning target. I had no idea they were looking directly at the agent who had spent months building the case that would end their careers, because Marcus had never once crossed their path before. Not directly. Not in any way they could have recognized. He had stayed in the shadows on purpose, watching from a distance, letting them believe the street belonged to them completely, tracking the small business owners who paid them monthly to be left alone, cataloging the arrests that never quite matched the paperwork filed to justify them. He had built a file thick enough to end 4 careers and thin enough, still, to need one final piece, something undeniable, something that could not be explained away in a hearing room months later. Back in the present, Officer Doyle had produced a pair of handcuffs and was preparing to close them around Marcus's wrists, certain that nothing about this morning would ever leave that parking lot. It was Bracco who made the first real mistake, shoving Marcus hard enough that his shoulder cracked against the frame of the car, then turning to the others and announcing, loudly enough for anyone nearby to hear, that the suspect had resisted, that he had assaulted an officer, inventing an offense out of thin air to justify whatever came next. Whitfield nodded along with the story, as though it had already become fact simply by being spoken aloud, and Doyle pulled out a small notepad, scribbling a few lines that bore no resemblance to anything that had actually happened. Kowalski, meanwhile, reached up and flipped a small switch on his own body camera, thumbing it off with the practiced ease of a man who had done it before and gotten away with it every time. He murmured to Doyle that now there would be no footage, nothing to worry about, as if the absence of one camera meant the absence of every camera in the world. He was wrong. Above them, tucked into the corner of a streetlight and inside the dashboard of an unmarked car parked half a block away, 2 separate Bureau surveillance devices were already capturing every second of what was happening, and side angles the 4 officers didn't know existed, evidence accumulating in real time, even as they believed themselves to be operating in total privacy. A third recording, quieter still, was running from a small microphone sewn into the collar of Marcus's own jacket, catching every slur, every threat, every casual boast with perfect clarity. Marcus, for his part, did not resist, did not raise his voice, did not give them the reaction they were hoping for. He simply stood there and absorbed it, memorizing each face, each name stitched onto each uniform, each specific word, and each specific shove, filing it all away with the same clinical precision he had used to build cases against far more dangerous men than these. Something in the stillness of his expression had begun to shift, though, a tightening around the eyes that suggested the balance in that parking lot was not nearly as settled as the 4 officers believed it to be. Emboldened by how easily Marcus had absorbed everything they had thrown at him, Sergeant Whitfield straightened up, hooked his thumbs into his belt, and announced to no one in particular that around here he was the law, a boast he had clearly made before and clearly believed. He shoved a blank incident report against the hood of the car and ordered Marcus to sign it, a document with no charges written in, no explanation, nothing but a line waiting for a signature that would later be filled in with whatever story the 4 of them decided to tell. Marcus refused, quietly, without theatrics, simply stating that he would not sign a blank form, and something about the calm certainty in his voice seemed to needle at Whitfield more than any argument could have. Whitfield's face flushed, the kind of anger that came from a man unused to being told no, and he grabbed a fistful of Marcus's hoodie, yanking him half upright before shoving him back down again. The gesture meant purely to remind him who was in control. Doyle stepped forward, fist half raised, close enough that Marcus could see the decision forming behind his eyes, close enough that the moment felt like it was about to tip into something that could not be undone. Across the street, the older man with the broom had finally set it down entirely, phone raised, hands unsteady but determined, recording the scene from a distance he hoped was far enough to go unnoticed. A second car had pulled to the curb, a young mother inside pausing before she pulled away, watching through her windshield with an expression caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. For a fraction of a second, Marcus's calm nearly cracked, not out of fear, but out of the old worn instinct to protect himself the way any man would, an instinct he forced back down because he understood, better than anyone standing in that parking lot, exactly what was riding on his patience. He thought, briefly, of every witness who had trusted him with their story, every business owner who had risked their livelihood to speak the truth quietly in a back room, and he reminded himself that walking away from this moment, without breaking character, was the only way to make sure their courage had not been wasted. Then, from inside Whitfield's jacket pocket, a phone began to ring. He glanced down, saw a number he didn't recognize, and let it go to voicemail without a second thought. A few seconds later, it rang again. He silenced it a second time, irritated, muttering something about telemarketers, having absolutely no idea that the calls were coming from a bureau field office less than 10 minutes away, an office that had just received an emergency distress signal from one of its own agents and was now trying, with mounting urgency, to reach the very man who was refusing to answer. The third time the phone rang, before Whitfield could silence it again, a different sound cut through the parking lot entirely, the low, controlled rumble of engines approaching fast. 3 black SUVs turned the corner in tight formation and rolled to a stop in a loose semicircle, doors opening almost in unison. For half a second, all 4 officers assumed a SWAT team had arrived, some kind of backup they hadn't requested, and Bracco actually took a step back, hand drifting instinctively toward his own weapon. It wasn't SWAT. The men and women climbing out of those vehicles wore dark jackets with 3 bold letters stamped across the back, letters that made the blood drain slowly from Doyle's face as he read them. FBI. None of the 4 officers understood what was happening, not yet, their confusion plain and almost comical as a team of federal agents strode calmly across the parking lot, moving with the unhurried confidence of people who already knew exactly how this scene was going to end. Onlookers who had gathered at a careful distance began pulling out their phones, sensing that something enormous was unfolding, though none of them yet understood what it was. The lead agent, a woman named Sarah Mitchell, walked directly past all 4 officers without so much as a glance in their direction and stopped in front of Marcus, still pinned against the hood of his own car. She said a single word, "Sir," and Marcus, coffee stain drying on the pavement beside him, wrists still hovering near the cuffs Doyle had never managed to close, gave a small, tired nod. The 4 officers stood frozen, the sudden, sick understanding beginning to dawn on each of their faces at almost exactly the same moment. Marcus straightened up slowly, rolling one shoulder where Bracco's shove had left a dull ache, and reached into an inner pocket that had gone untouched throughout the entire encounter, producing a leather case that fell open to reveal a gold and blue federal badge. He held it up first for Whitfield, then Doyle, then Bracco, then Kowalski, letting each man take a long look, giving them exactly the amount of time they needed to fully absorb what they were seeing. "My name is Marcus Ellison," he told them, his voice even, almost gentle, "and I am the agent in charge of the investigation into this precinct." The entire parking lot went silent, except for the low idle of engines and the distant hum of morning traffic somewhere beyond the block. Kowalski stammered that it wasn't possible, the words tumbling out half-formed, his eyes darting toward the others, as though one of them might offer some explanation that would make the ground stop shifting beneath him. Bracco simply stared, his mouth slightly open, the fabricated story about resisting arrest already dissolving into nothing on his tongue. Doyle took a step backward, bumping into his own cruiser, as if putting distance between himself and Marcus might undo the last several minutes entirely. Marcus only looked at Kowalski and said that they had just finished the final piece of evidence in a case that had taken months to build, and that everything he needed, he now had, delivered by their own hands in broad daylight. Agent Mitchell stepped forward and informed the 4 men that their phones, their body cameras, their dashcam footage, their patrol logs, and their personal financial records had already been secured under federal warrant, effective as of that morning, and that any attempt to destroy or alter evidence would only add further charges to what was already an extensive list. Whitfield tried to speak, tried to summon some version of the authority he had wielded so easily only minutes earlier, but nothing came out except a dry, broken sound. The last remnant of a man who had spent 20 years believing the badge on his own chest made him untouchable. The precinct captain arrived within the hour, alerted by a call from the field office rather than from any of his own men, and stood at the edge of the parking lot with an expression that shifted from confusion to disbelief to something closer to shame as Agent Mitchell walked him through the outline of what her team had uncovered. He asked, quietly, how long the four of them had been operating this way under his own command. And Mitchell told him the honest answer: years, not months. A pattern that had been allowed to continue simply because no one above them had ever bothered to look closely enough to notice. The captain said nothing else for a long moment, watching as Doyle was guided into the back of a federal vehicle, watching as the badge he had once been proud to command was quietly stripped of whatever meaning it still held for the four men wearing it. What followed happened with the kind of speed that suggested it had all been planned to the minute, because it had. Agents moved through the patrol cars first, pulling laptops and paperwork, sliding evidence bags over radios and duty logs. They searched the officers' lockers back at the precinct within the hour, uncovering envelopes of cash that no legitimate paycheck could explain, along with a small ledger in Whitfield's own handwriting listing payments from more than a dozen local businesses stretching back years, some entries dating as far back as 5 years earlier. Personal phones were seized on the spot, their contents already being mirrored onto bureau servers before the four men had even been formally read their rights. Text messages surfaced within hours, casual conversations about which shop owners were behind on payments, which arrests could be quietly overlooked for the right price, which residents could be leaned on without consequence. Bank accounts, flagged weeks earlier during the quiet, patient groundwork of the investigation, were frozen before lunchtime. Bracco, sensing the walls closing in around him, made a break for the tree line at the edge of the parking lot, sprinting maybe 15 yards before two agents brought him down without much effort at all. His attempt at escape, adding one more charge to a list that was already growing longer by the hour. Doyle sat on the curb, with his head in his hands, muttering that he hadn't meant for any of it to go this far, a claim that rang hollow against the weight of everything the agents were now pulling out of his own patrol car. Kowalski asked, weakly, whether there was any way to make this go away, and received only silence in return, the kind of silence that answered the question more completely than words ever could. By early afternoon, agents had cataloged nearly 200 separate pieces of evidence connecting the four officers to more than 3 years of coordinated extortion, a scope far larger than even Marcus had initially suspected when he first opened the file. A search of Whitfield's home turned up a small safe hidden behind a false panel in his garage, containing close to $60,000 in cash, along with a second, more detailed ledger cross, referencing the names of at least 9 separate businesses. Kowalski's own patrol car yielded a burner phone used exclusively to coordinate payment pickups, its message history intact and untouched, never imagining anyone outside the four of them would ever read it. Investigators also uncovered a pattern of falsified arrest reports stretching back years, cases where residents had been charged with resisting arrest or disorderly conduct after refusing to pay, charges that had quietly ruined more than one person's ability to find steady work in the years since. Each new discovery added another layer to a case that had already been strong enough to end 4 careers before that morning in the parking lot had even begun. Marcus watched the whole unraveling without a trace of satisfaction on his face. No smile, no triumphant word, nothing that resembled revenge. When Whitfield, cuffed now and sitting on the curb, looked up at him and asked, almost pleading, "How long?" Marcus answered simply that he had given them every opportunity to be the kind of officers they had sworn an oath to be, and that they had chosen, again and again, on their own, to be something else entirely. He did not raise his voice. He did not gloat. He simply turned and walked toward Agent Mitchell to begin the long process of documentation that would follow, leaving the 4 men to sit with the full weight of what they had done to themselves. Months passed before the case reached its conclusion. Months filled with depositions, evidence reviews, and the slow, grinding machinery of federal prosecution, working its way through 4 separate defendants and dozens of related charges. Witnesses came forward once they understood the investigation was real. Business owners who had quietly paid for years, finally willing to testify. Residents who had been afraid to speak, now standing in front of a grand jury and describing exactly what had happened to them. Frank Delgado, the restaurant owner whose original complaint had started the entire case, later stood outside the courthouse and said simply that he finally felt safe walking his own neighborhood again, a sentence that meant more to Marcus than any commendation the Bureau could have offered him. Marcus sat through most of it from a distance, called occasionally to confirm details, but largely content to let the evidence speak for itself the way it had been designed to from the very beginning. The trial itself stretched across nearly 3 weeks, held in a courtroom that filled a little more each day as word spread through the community about what the 4 officers had done. Prosecutors laid out the evidence methodically, the ledgers, the recordings, the financial trail that connected years of quiet extortion to men who had sworn an oath to protect the very people they were exploiting. Carol Jenks took the stand on the 4th day, describing in a steady voice the years she had spent hiding cash payments from her own daughter, afraid that even her family would somehow put the arrangement at risk if they knew. Patricia Vance testified 2 days later, recounting the specific afternoon Bracco had stood in her doorway, describing, in detail, exactly which violations he intended to invent if she ever stopped paying. Defense attorneys tried, in turn, to paint the case as overreach, to suggest that ordinary policing decisions had been twisted into something sinister. But the recordings from that parking lot, the same recordings the 4 men never knew existed, undercut every argument they attempted to make. Playing on a courtroom screen, while all 4 defendants sat and listened to their own voices, confirming everything the prosecution had already laid out on paper. When the jury returned, it took less than a full day of deliberation to reach verdicts on all 4 men, a swiftness that surprised even some of the attorneys who had worked the case for months. When the trial finally ended, the verdicts came down with a weight that felt, to everyone who had followed the case, like something closer to relief than celebration. Whitfield, Doyle, Bracco, and Kowalski each received sentences appropriate to the scope of what they had done: years behind bars for corruption, for falsified reports, for the unlawful use of force against people who had trusted them to protect rather than harm. Local news covered the sentencing for exactly 1 news cycle before the story faded into the background, the way most stories eventually do. But for the people who had lived under those 4 men's version of the law for years, the verdict meant something that no headline could fully capture. The director of the field office personally thanked Marcus for his work, calling the case one of the cleanest and most thoroughly documented internal corruption investigations the Bureau had run in years, and offering him his choice of assignment for whatever came next. Marcus declined every request for an interview, every offer to speak publicly about what had happened in that parking lot, every suggestion that his story might make for a compelling profile somewhere. He simply wanted to go back to the quiet life he had built for himself, the same modest apartment, the same worn hoodie, the same old sedan that still ran fine despite its age. He returned, in the weeks that followed, to the same convenience store, greeted once again by Walter behind the counter, who had no idea the quiet handyman he had served coffee to for months had quietly ended one of the ugliest chapters in the precinct's history. On the corner of his desk at home sat the same photograph Kowalski had once mocked without understanding it: Elena and their daughter, a small, steady reminder of exactly why Marcus had chosen, all those years ago, to spend his life holding other people accountable to the same standard he held himself to. On his last day, walking out of the federal building downtown, a young agent named Daniel Cole fell into step beside him, curiosity finally getting the better of professional restraint. He asked the question that had been sitting with half the office since the case closed: why Marcus hadn't simply identified himself the moment those 4 officers surrounded him, why he had let it go as far as it went, the shoving, the slurs, the mockery of a dead woman's photograph, when a single sentence could have ended it all in seconds. Marcus stopped near the top of the steps, considered the question for a moment the way he considered most things, carefully, without rushing toward an easy answer, and then allowed himself the smallest trace of a smile. "If I had told them who I was too soon," he said, "they would never have shown me who they really were." Cole nodded slowly, understanding settling over him the way it did for most agents somewhere in their first few years. The recognition that patience, more than any weapon or any badge, was often the sharpest tool the job ever gave a person. Marcus adjusted the collar of his jacket, glanced once more at the quiet street stretching out beyond the steps, and told the younger agent that the job was never about proving who held the power in a given moment. It was about waiting long enough for the truth to prove itself, because people who believed no one was watching almost always revealed exactly who they were. He added, quietly, that the hardest part had never been the waiting itself, but learning to carry another man's cruelty without letting it change who he was underneath the uniform he wore, whichever uniform that happened to be on a given day. Cole asked one more question, softer than the first, whether it had been worth it, all those months of silence, all those small humiliations absorbed without a word in return. Marcus thought of Elena's photograph, of the daughter growing up somewhere beyond the frame of this story, of every business owner who could finally sleep without fear of a knock at the door, and he told Cole that it had been worth every single hour of it, because somewhere in this city, people were safer than they had been the week before, and that, more than any badge or commendation, was the only measure of the job that had ever mattered to him. Frank Delgado reopened his restaurant's back patio that same month, something he said he had been too afraid to do for years, worried that any small improvement to his business would only invite a larger monthly payment. Carol Jenks put a new sign in her laundromat window. Nothing dramatic, just a small handwritten note thanking her regular customers for their patience during what she called a difficult stretch, though everyone on that block understood exactly what she meant. Patricia Vance expanded her daycare within the year, finally comfortable enough to take on more children than she had ever dared to before, no longer living under the quiet threat that had shaped every decision she made. None of them ever learned Marcus's name, and he preferred it that way, content to let the change speak for itself, rather than asking anyone to remember who had made it possible. He walked the rest of the way down the steps alone, past the low stone wall that marked the edge of the federal building's grounds, out onto a sidewalk that carried him toward another ordinary block in another ordinary part of the city. Somewhere behind him, Cole watched him go, filing away the lesson the way agents did when they recognized they had just been given something they would carry for the rest of their careers. Then he turned, coat collar up against the wind, and walked on down the steps and into the ordinary rhythm of another quiet morning, the kind of morning he had spent his whole career trying to make possible for people who would never know his name.